Here we turn to a very different kind of reading. Tenzin Namdul's Re-Examining Death, Doors to Resilience and Well-Being in Tibetan Buddhist Practice. Namdul occupies an unusual position. He is both a Tibetan medical doctor and an anthropologist trained at Emory. This dual-lens insider and analyst is what makes the article so valuable. The title of this lecture, The Luminous Continuum, refers to a concept at the heart of the Tibetan Buddhist model of death. The idea that consciousness does not terminate at brain death, but continues through a series of transitions, including a moment of ground luminosity that is considered the deepest encounter with the nature of mind. We will build toward that concept step by step. We begin with a patient in an ICU. Namdul opens with a case of Pema, a young Tibetan woman found unresponsive after ingesting a neurotoxic substance. She is rushed to an ICU in southern India. After 6 days unconscious and on a ventilator, the head neurologist tells the family, Pema is brain dead. He recommends disconnecting life support. But a Tibetan medical doctor also examines Pema. Using pulse diagnosis, he reaches a completely different conclusion. Her pulse is firm, her consciousness is intact, and crucially, she became tearful when the doctor spoke with her parents. He advises the family to wait at least 2 weeks. Follow the timeline on this slide. Day 1, the incident and admission. Day 6, the divergent assessments. Day 20, Pema regains partial awareness. The neurologist calls it a miracle. Within 3 weeks, she is discharged and eventually makes a full recovery. The point is not that one doctor was right and the other wrong. The point is that they were using fundamentally different markers to determine whether Pema was alive or dead. This slide puts the two diagnostic frameworks side by side. On the left, the biomedical lens. The neurologist assessed Pema's cerebral cortex, the region responsible for higher thought, decision-making, speech, social interaction. It was severely damaged. His conclusion: she could never be a complete person again. The key marker is brain function. On the right, the consciousness lens. The Tibetan doctor assessed Pema's pulse and her emotional responsiveness. She wept when her parents spoke to the doctor. His conclusion: her consciousness was intact, she was aware of her situation, and she had a desire to recover. The key marker is consciousness, understood as something broader than neural activity. This is not a fringe disagreement. Namdul observed this pattern throughout his 18 months of fieldwork. Tibetan caregivers, doctors, monks, and family members alike all held the collective goal of caring for the dying person's consciousness, and all agreed that a person is alive as long as consciousness has not left the body. How did we arrive at brain death as the standard? This slide traces the history. In the 1950s, the mechanical ventilator and EEG created a new problem. Machines could sustain heartbeat and respiration in patients whose brains had ceased to function. What was the patient's status? In the 1960s, the need for transplantable organs gave urgency to the question. The 1968 Harvard Ad Hoc Committee proposed irreversible coma as the new criterion for death, making it legally possible to both withdraw treatment and harvest organs. Read the insight at the bottom of this slide. Margaret Locke argues that brain death is a theory created in the service of a practice, organ procurement. It is not a neutral scientific discovery, but a legal and institutional construction. Dick Teresi puts it bluntly: rather than illuminating death, modern technology has only expanded the breadth of our ignorance. If you define death as a measurable biological event, brain scan, EEG readout, legal checkbox, what happens to everything else? This slide maps the downstream consequences. Mortality salience. The awareness of your own death generates alienation. The individual is isolated and medicalized. Terror management theory, developed by Solomon, Greenberg, and Pashinsky, shows that when people are reminded of their mortality without cultural tools to process it, they respond with hostility, rigid judgment, and attempts to convert or punish those who threaten their worldview. The result is what Haider calls modern death: secular, sterile, and singular. By treating mortality as an engineering problem to be solved, we have generated a culture terrified of the void. Rachel Menzies' clinical work confirms this. Unprocessed death anxiety generates feelings of powerlessness, loneliness, and meaninglessness, and can seriously weaken an individual's capacity for happiness or peace. Now we cross into the Tibetan Buddhist framework, and the starting point is different from anything in the biomedical model. The natural law: everything that arises will disintegrate. The Tibetan word for world, jig-rten, literally means disintegrate and basis. The cosmology is built on impermanence. The nature of the event: death is not an endpoint but a transition, a bardo, literally a gap between two states. A common expression Namdul heard in the field: death is like going back home. The primal marker: consciousness, not brain function. The canonical medical text, the Arjya Bzhi, states that nothing comes into life without consciousness, and no one is dead until consciousness leaves the body. The Dalai Lama puts it simply: life is the basis for consciousness. When the body can no longer support consciousness, there is death. This is the comparison slide, and it functions similarly to the bioethical divide table in the previous lecture on Stonington. Take a moment to read across each row. Primary marker of death, cessation of brain function versus separation of consciousness from the body. Nature of the event, an instantaneous mechanical failure versus a fluid, multi-stage transition through the bardos. Societal response, terror management and technological prolongation versus psychological adaptation, moral supervision, and deep contemplation. Goal of end-of-life care, sustain organ function and physiological homeostasis versus care for the dying consciousness to ensure a peaceful transition. Again, neither column is correct, but notice how profoundly the choice of primary marker shapes everything else downstream. If death is brain failure, you manage organs. If death is a consciousness transition, you manage the quality of awareness. This is the structural backbone of the Tibetan model, 6 intervals or gaps constituting the full cycle of existence. The bardo of this life spans from birth to active dying. Within it sit 2 sub-bardos, the bardo of dream and the bardo of meditation. Then the bardo of dying, from active dying to the moment of death. After that, the luminous bardo or dharmata, the after-death experience of ground luminosity, considered the ultimate nature of mind as pure awareness. This is concomitant with clinical death in biomedicine. For trained practitioners, this is the most fertile ground for meditation, and where some enter the state called tukdam. Finally, the bardo of becoming subtle consciousness wanders seeking a new form until it enters a womb and the cycle begins again. The key insight: by viewing death as a transition, identical to falling asleep or entering meditation, the binary terror of alive versus dead dissolves. The bardo provides an in-between state. This slide draws a remarkable parallel. On the left, clinical trials at NYU and Johns Hopkins administered psilocybin to terminal cancer patients. The results, validated by fMRI, showed reduced activity in the default mode network, the brain region associated with the autobiographical ego. Patients reported ego dissolution, profound love, loss of fear of death. On the right, Tibetan Buddhist practitioners who simulate the dying process in meditation report strikingly similar phenomenology: deep resilience, joy, and realization of the ultimate nature of mind. Some practitioners, including the Dalai Lama, report practicing dying 5 to 6 times daily. The convergence is captured in the line at the bottom of the slide. From David Loy, absolute groundlessness equals complete groundedness. When the self dissolves, what remains is not terror, but universal connection. The pharmacological route and the contemplative route arrive at a similar destination. Namdul draws on Jeffrey Bishop's call for a bio-psycho-socio-spiritual model of care and argues that Tibetan culture already practices something like it. The base layer is biological, understanding the formation and disintegration of the body at gross, subtle, and very subtle levels. The middle layer is socio-psychological, transforming one's relationship to oneself, others, and death, producing focused attention, calm mind, and joy. The apex is spiritual and philosophical, impermanence and emptiness, as frameworks that provide meaning and allow death to be viewed from multiple perspectives. The arrows on this diagram matter. Using dying as a vantage point for self-inquiry feeds upward into psychological transformation, which feeds into philosophical realization. The system is integrated, not 3 separate domains, but a single practice with biological, psychological, and spiritual dimensions operating simultaneously. This slide maps the functional role death plays in Tibetan daily life, not just at the end of life, but throughout it. The input: daily contemplation of mortality, treated as an available authority or moral supervisor. Namdul's interlocutors told him that when someone was too excited, saddened, or irrational, a common reminder was, "Have you forgotten you are going to die?" The process: awareness of death serves as a vantage point for self-inquiry and as a moral compass. 86% of monks, 82% of Tibetan doctors, and 78% of laypeople in Namdul's survey, though fearful of death, saw it as a vital facet of life that motivates ethical behavior. The output: ongoing stable states, cultivating a resilient self supported by what Tibetans call snaying stabs, literally heart power, the power of resilience, supported by a compassionate heart. Contrast this with terror management theory, where mortality reminders produce hostility and rigidity. The difference is not the reminder, it is the cultural framework that receives it. Namdul's field supervisor, Geshe Phuntsok, explained that how one dies is directly related to one's past practice and determines one's future rebirth. There are 3 levels. The beginner applies death as a reminder of impermanence, lives ethically, and can potentially die without remorse, but may still be fearful. The intermediate practitioner has studied the nature of mind, understands how mind and body change during dying, and has done preliminary practices. This person can potentially die without remorse or fear. The adept has led an ethical life governed by love and compassion, mastered the nature of mind, simulated the dying process to gain lived experience, and knows how to transit through each bardo. This person can die confidently, with love and joy. Notice the progression: ethical behavior, then study of mind, then embodied practice. Each step builds on the previous one. This is not abstract philosophy, it is a training curriculum for dying well. 3 takeaways as we close. First, death is a whole-person transition, not a single organ failure. The Tibetan model insists on this, and the Pema case demonstrates that the consequences of getting this wrong are not abstract. Second, integrating the biopsycho-socio-spiritual model allows us to treat the dying consciousness, not just address the failing body. Third, and this is the provocation, by yielding to our mortality, we dismantle the anxiety of the ego, transforming death from an unendurable terror into a daily catalyst for resilience, compassion, and meaning. Think back to the Stonington reading from last time. Airy Rat refusing morphine to study her tumor, the Karma Masters, the choreography of the deathbed. Both readings point in the same direction. The Western biomedical model captures only a fraction of what is happening when a person dies. The question for bioethics is whether we can build frameworks capacious enough to hold the rest. That is where we will pick up next time.